Hello, everybody. Is this working?
No, I don't think so. That's the stream's
Oh,
microphone.
okay. Okay. Can everybody hear me? Because I'm not mic'd up, but this is a small space, so I think this will work. Okay, well, welcome to all of you here in the Robert F. Kidd Library to our latest event in the ongoing Little Kanawha Reading Series. And welcome to all of you out there in cyberspace watching this via our YouTube live feed. As you probably know, the Little Kanawha Reading Series is a collaboration between the Department of Language and Literature, the Department of Social Science, and the Robert F. Kidd Library. Its mission is to provide a showcase for a diversity of literary forms and voices in order to acknowledge and enrich the cultural heritage of Appalachia and the communities around the Little Kanawha River. It is my pleasure to welcome Jeff James, tonight's special guest. And in many ways, he's the perfect embodiment of our mission. Jeff is a local fellow. He's from right here in Glenville originally. His father is John James, a Professor Emeritus of GCU. Jeff's roots go deep here, but he's been out in the world doing interesting things and leading an incredibly successful career. Among his many accomplishments, he co-founded Create West Virginia, a nonprofit initiative to advance innovative economic opportunities in West Virginia. He's also the author of the recent book, Giving Up Whiteness, One Man's Journey. And let me tell you, I love this book. It's an intelligent, well-researched, and sincere book that documents his personal quest to understand race and to imagine a healthier, more productive way to live in a diverse society. In fact, I was telling Jeff this earlier, but I love this book so much, I bought multiple copies, and I've given it to friends and family alike. So Jeff is going to talk to us a bit and share his insights and share from this book. Afterwards, we'll open the floor up for questions. Please feel free to stick around after. I know some of you can't. There's a fairly important game happening. But do stick around. Grab a snack before you go. Buy a copy of his book. All of the proceeds are going to GSU's various diversity initiatives. Or just stick around and say hello. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming back to Glenville, Jeff James.
Hello.
Hello.
This is a surreal moment to come back to your hometown and talk about a book that you wrote, but it's an incredible delight. I love coming back to Glenville anytime I can. Some of you know I used to live in West Virginia. I came back to West Virginia for about 10 years when I did Create West Virginia and other things, but then I moved to Nashville. I'm in Philadelphia now, so any excuse to come back. Jonathan's like, we'll pay for your hotel. Like, no, I'll come. Don't worry about it. I'm there. I have to say, though, there's a little added pressure. I have my senior English teacher in the audience. And that's a little bit of pressure. So I hope there's no grammatical errors in tonight's conversation. Also, I wanted to be here on time. I know we've got a big game, Go Pioneers. This is fantastic. I want to see the game, too, so I'll get you out of here. But I came in last night, actually, and I just got out of the traffic circle, and I was nervous. I could not find Mineral Road. I was trying to find my old house, and it's gone. I'm like, I'm in New Jersey now, this land of traffic circles. Anyway, no, just a delight to be back. A lot of great people. I wish I could just give a shout out to everyone who's here, in addition to Mrs. Mees and her husband. My cousins have come all the way from Ohio, and a lot of great people, so thank you. I grew up on this campus, essentially. As Jonathan mentioned, my dad taught here for, I don't even know how many years, 20-some years. And my mom, of course, taught elementary education here. And I was so thrilled to see all my childhood books are upstairs in the children's section, donated when my dad passed. And so I had a lot of support from this community. My summer days would literally be go play basketball in the Lily gym, and then go beg Dad for money to go to the student union for some snacks. And then I would stay here in this library all afternoon, sometimes reading books, mostly going into the microfiche. Remember that? Microfiche department, those big old film strip things. And I would read stories of my basketball heroes from the 70s, all the West Virginia players that I looked up to and stuff. So, and then I made myself sick, because you can't watch that stuff for more than an hour without making yourself nauseous. But this place shaped me tremendously, as I'm sure many of your hometowns have. The values that I was exposed to, certainly in my family, in my church, I went to First Baptist downtown, and then the community, my teachers, it was just phenomenal. And of course, when you're here, you're like, I gotta get out of here. But then when you're looking back, you're like, I had the most beautiful and nurturing, incredible childhood. And so there are seeds from that childhood that you'll start seeing, I think, kind of thematically through what I learned writing this book. There were also some experiences that planted seeds that were even subconscious about tonight's topic, which is understanding what whiteness is as a phenomenon, what race is, and there's some really just, one of the things I really want to try to do tonight is sort of pop the bubble of tension around some of these topics. I really want to give you some definitions, make it feel like, because the reason I wrote this book was to share with you all of my screw-ups and all of my learnings throughout this process, so that hopefully more people are comfortable going on their own journey and being okay with admitting that, I want to be on the right side of things. I want to be one of the good guys, but I just don't get everything. Like and that's why I wrote the book. I kept attempting to do right, and I kept failing, through not even any intentional reason. And so there's a, and she may actually show up here, Crystal, if you've read the book, my friend Crystal instigated the writing of this book because she challenged me. If you have a friend who will tell you the truth and challenge you in the context of a loving friendship, don't ever give that person up. And particularly in this situation, if they're a person of color who has, by the way, gone through this time after time, explaining to white people what they're going through, and still has the courage and the patience, to share with you. I am only here because so many friends of mine, who are, many diverse backgrounds, shared with me things. And yes, I was interested, so that helps. If you're actually willing to listen, they will share with you what their experience is. And so the motivation of the values that I grew up with, to love your neighbor, to seek justice, and to, include. My dad was a famous includer. I had so many college students growing up. My greatest moment in life, I shouldn't say that. That's a pretty strong statement. As my childhood life was when Dad invited the college basketball team to our house and on New Year's Eve, because I had nowhere to go. And if you're students here, you know what that what that's like. So the whole basketball team's at my house, and I'm just like, I can't believe that my heroes are sitting right there. But that's what Dad did. He just constantly included people, and that's where I learned that. So to sort of counter that, the topic tonight is, what is whiteness, and why would you even want to give that up? Like, what is it about that? There were also experiences that shaped my subconsciously what I expected to be the right way to live, the cultural standards, the standards of excellence, things that you just sort of assume. And you also get whenever you live in any kind of dominant society, this is not just endemic to Glenville, right? This is like any dominant culture. you are going to be infused with a set of expectations. And subconsciously, which I did not realize until later, one of those expectations is that whiteness is elevated in our culture and it's to be protected. And there were some, not great pleasant experiences that I share in the book that kind of taught me that. Some of them were very overt, but a lot of them were very subtle. And so at the same time, and this is where my history is a little different than a lot of history of other kids who grew up, in Glenville or Gilmer County at that time. And that is that I had some experiences that sort of, I like to say it sort of puts a virus in the Matrix code. If you've ever seen the Matrix movies, we're sort of living in this sort of surreal thing. And if there's a glitch in the code, it's going to cause you to like, oh, wait a minute, it's not just this, it's also this. My glitch, which I still believe to this day, started when I was 4 and 5 years old. My dad would go to Morgantown to study for his PhD, and one year we stayed there for a whole year. And all of my playmates in the dirt under the porch of this apartment building were Chinese, Afghani, African American. Those were my friends. And so when you're that young, and I'm going to talk about our brains here in just a minute, the shaping of those experiences changes things. It sort of plants a seed that can potentially come to fruition later. So we're in an interesting dynamic in our country today, aren't we? There's a lot of political tension. It's so hard to even have a conversation like this. I commend Glenville State University. I'm going to get used to that. And Jonathan and the whole team that allowed me to come here tonight. It's a tough topic, but it's a topic we have to keep talking about, or what happens? We go right back to the horrible place that we came out of. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So I talked about why I care, why I did this. Crystal, my friend, texted me one time. It was after it was 2015. I had just moved to Nashville, and there was yet another police shooting of an unarmed African American. But then there also was the horrible shooting at the Charleston AME Church, if you remember that. The kid went to Bible study, and it was just horrific. And I was just apoplectic. And Crystal and I were very close then, and we still are. But I just texted her. I said, Crystal, what can I do? What can I do to help other white people get on board with anti-racism? And she replied, it's very simple. She was in a certain mood, you can tell at the same time. She said, it's very simple. White people are not white. Give up whiteness. And I had never heard of that. I never presented in that way, right? And I'm like, can I do that? Do I give up my white card somewhere? Like, what is this? And what she was challenging, it was for me to go deeper and even understanding my identity as a white person. I'd never really done that before. I was on board with equality and all these good things, but no one had ever challenged me to think about, where did this even come from? And it was like a calling. I never in my life set out to write a book, but I had to at that point. I had to take her up on her challenge and research myself. Why are we in this situation? Where did this stuff come from? Let me just start with this. Let me give you some definitions, okay? Because part of the problem is the semantics of the language that we use sometimes, okay? Race. What is race? Think of what is your, you don't have to, if you want to, you can, but you don't have to shout it. But think about, what is even race? What is that? Most people's understanding of it is some combination of outward appearance, characteristics, and then some understanding of maybe ancestry. Sort of glue those things together. That's what most people think of as race. But the reality is race has changed constantly through history. If we were, 400 years ago, there would be 30 or 40 different races that people, like the Romans thought of the Germans as an entirely different race of people. And so the word was more often thought of as like nation, or tribe, right? So in the Bible, sometimes there's translations of race. That's not literally race as we understand it. That would be like a nation or a tribe, right? So that's one thing to think about. This thing is made up. The categories of racial categorization that we currently have were invented. And they're not a biological, like, oh, there's black, there's white. You can't do that. And the reason we know that is to sort of hop ahead to about 20 years ago, the human genome, human DNA was mapped. They like supercomputers. They just like, here's what makes up humans. And guess what they found? We're all the same. We are less than 0.1% genetic difference across anyone. And here's what else they found. This is the part that blew my mind. People of the same race can be further apart genetically than me and an Asian person or African American person. I could be more in common with an African American person DNA-wise than a white person. So you start looking at that, and then you compare biological categorization. A lot of the racial stuff was invented in the Enlightenment era when, if you know that time, they were going crazy trying to classify all the animals and all the trees, and and so, let's do it for humans. Well, the reality is that humans are too close together. There is no difference from anyone that's human. I don't care what color you are or where you came from, that would justify a different categorization of person. One of the funniest things I saw when I was reading about this, you can have two penguins pulled from the same flock of, I don't know, what's a penguin group called? A pen of penguins, I don't know. So, pull two penguins from the same population, their genetic variation is more than any given human in the world. That blew my mind. So again, this stuff is made up. It's a culturally made up thing. So that's important. So therefore, what is racism? It really stinks to have that lobbied at you, like, oh, you're racist. Everyone's like, you're frustrated, you're defensive, you're, whatever. But what even is racism? Well, if you stop and think about it, and you sort of look at what people that really study this, what is racism? It's racial prejudice, right? So it's some sort of bias related to your understanding of race, plus the power to influence another person's life. So you're biased in some way, and whether you're a teacher or someone who hires people or a police officer or even a friend, you have power, you have influence over another person. This really got me thinking because none of us will ever want to be called that word, right? It's just, we would just react to it. But all of us have subconscious bias. So even if we don't intend to hurt someone else, and this is what I caught in my own life, was I never intended to ever hurt anyone with a comment or a misunderstood action or any of that. But when you start realizing that even unintended bias is still bias, and it still has the power to hurt another person and limit, their human experience. So one of the ways that we can all get off of this, like, we don't want to talk about it, is, I come from the Christian faith, right? So we're all sinners. We have all screwed up somehow. Yeah, we're all racist. I'm racist. Everyone is racist, that has the power to influence another person's life. And, before we get, again, sort of, I feel a certain way about being called that, if we were in any other dominant culture who had the same sort of bias, let me tell you a very quick story. A friend of mine, who was, would be categorized as European white, he got an incredible job at a Chinese chemical company in China. So like top level, C-level role. He went out there in like 6 months, the Chinese Communist Party were like, we're not sure how you got here, but you are not allowed to have this job. That has to be a Chinese person in that job. So in other words, yes, they had cultural bias and standards, and they wanted a Chinese person. So of course, you're going to run into bias and the power to exert that bias in almost every culture in the world. So I share that only because we are responsible for dealing with our culture and our bias, right? And I hope that other countries and other people do too, but our responsibility is our own. So that's very key. So that's racism. So what is the white race? If race is this sort of invented thing, what is white? Well, it turns out that even the concept of white as a race, so it used to be called Caucasian, named after the Caucasus Mountains over in Turkey and somewhere over there in Russia. There's it kind of goes through a few countries. Yes, so that's when the sort of European scientists went on their classification binge, and they started sort of collecting. And again, it changed. One scientist would have 7, another scientist would have 5, another one would have 3. They were just like, okay, we're just doing our best here. However, the white part of it, like literally the name white as opposed to Caucasian, started taking shape as colonialism started to pick up steam. So European countries looking for ways to, enrich their sponsor, king or queen or company, they started using language like white that was associated with what? The purity of whiteness in the Christian religion. So what happened is in the Enlightenment era, so 17th, really like 16th through like 19th century, mostly 18th, 19th century, this stuff started really taking shape. And it was a combination of a profit motive to go, come to America, come to Africa, come to South America. And in those days, absolutely, take the resources. How do you get away with that in your conscience without justification for it? So you had a profit motive, you had a religious created justification. Some of you may have heard of the curse of Ham. Some of you may have even been taught that. Terrible misinterpretation of Genesis. And justified, oh, well, God cursed this darker group of people here to be slaves and servants, so yeah, we should go do that. We should take, any theologian worth their salt will tell you that is not what it says at all. That was clearly bent to justify the purpose. And scientists at the time were pulled into this justification, and they started measuring skulls and how this person, the body type, and just all kinds of malarkey in terms of like applying what they wanted to see in the data to justify what they were doing. And you heard this a lot. Well, particularly on the religious side, the better off theory. This is really heinous, historical theory, but they're better off if we go invade and take over because we'll civilize people. You're already like, man, this is twisted. But the reality is, let's just take Africa as an example. You know where the world's largest library was? Actually in Timbuktu, on the eastern side. And it had hundreds of thousands of items. The Muslim culture kind of built that up. To this day, when Al-Qaeda was sort of running around destroying things, they targeted Timbuktu's, many thousands of items, and people smuggled them out so that they wouldn't get destroyed. So they're still here. There's many other sophisticated cultures from ancient Africa that none of us, I could probably guess, heard about growing up in our history classes, but they were there. So it's bogus, but whenever a human has a particularly profit motive to justify something, unfortunately, the theological and the moral sort of gets kind of bent. So that's just history, right? I can show you, there's a lot of documentation in the book. There's many more things that you can look at. You can look this up. It is documented. Okay, so one more thing I want to share with you. This continuum of inclusion, right? So there's a continuum of understanding how we relate to each other. On the sort of ugly side that we think of nowadays as racism is segregation. That's physically trying to keep people apart. We saw that in South Africa, you saw that in the South, you saw that differently in the North. We like to sort of kind of throw shade at the South, but it's very similar things happening in the North. It wasn't as overt and just sort of vicious sometimes, but it was there. But that's segregation, right? And so the official policy of the United States after it was created basically started floating towards segregation. So it showed up in the Constitution. Originally, the Constitution was like, hey, as long as you're a male, I won't even get into the gender problems, but if you were a landowning male, you had all these rights. You could vote, you could do all these things. Didn't say anything about race or anything. But over time, things started veering legally into this path. And so you saw a definition of citizenship later on become only white people from Europe could be citizens of the United States as they immigrated. The Chinese came here to build railroads, many of you know, and they summarily got kicked out of the country with the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was the first time that a literal ethnic group was put into law that you're not allowed in the country. And there was a lot of that kind of stuff going on. So that all happened. I'm not going to get into all the history of slavery and Civil War. Hopefully you know a good chunk of that. But where I want to pick it up again real quickly is what happened after the Civil War? Guys, we had an opportunity to get this right 150 years ago. And I'm sure you've heard of Reconstruction. After the defeat of the Confederacy, the Union set up shop with soldiers to sort of make sure things were running the way that the law said it should be run, which is everyone can vote. Black voting participation skyrocketed. Guys, we had a black senator from Mississippi in the 1870s. I mean, a lot of people are like, huh? We can't even get one now, much less. It was because the voting rights were enforced, and so that happened. So again, you probably know the story. The Union and North sort of like, all right, the political winds started changing. Let's not keep our soldiers down there. Let's get out of there. Not surprisingly, all the Confederate leaders of the time went back into leadership of the southern states. And even though so we did pass the 13th Amendment, which, constitutionally banned slavery, but there were some loopholes. And so the ex-Confederates came back in. They started arresting. This is an amazing book that I'll remember the name here. It's listed in here as a resource. But they would go and arrest black people on trumped up charges like, oh, there's some people over there, you're vagrants, we're going to arrest you for vagrancy, put them in prison. And then what did they do? They farmed them out to plantations and organizations at like pennies on the dollar. Of course, none of the prisoners saw the money. The money went to the local sheriff, and the whole thing, it was a re-enslavement of people. My jaw dropped. I'd never heard how broad this was. And it lasted all the way up into the 1930s. So that went on a long time. So that's one example. Other examples, again, this is like official policy, right? This isn't just a few bad apples and doing this stuff. Right after the Civil War, this amazing act called the Homestead Act got passed, if you've heard of that. Essentially what that means is if you wanted free land, all you had to do was send in a form to the government, a couple dollars for processing, very cheap, and they would give you a big swath of Western land. Where did they get the land? Yes, they took it from Native American indigenous people, but here's the land, and go get it. To this day, it's estimated about half of white families can trace ancestors who got wealth from that land giveaway. Who did not get any land? African Americans and other people of color. They were summarily not allowed to participate. And especially back then, I mean, land was that's the way to create wealth, right? Like it was agricultural, the whole thing. So that was massive. And to this day, even if you're the same level of education, the average African American family and the average white family, the net worth, so like household worth, is $100,000 for a white family, $10,000 for a black family. Where's most of that wealth sitting? It's in real estate and prior access to resources. One that's closer home to me, GI Bill. Any veteran families, or your mom or dad probably was in World War II or something. My dad, luckily, didn't go to war, but it was like right after the Korean War. He was in the Army. So the GI Bill provided incredible benefits for veterans. So all these World War II guys would come back, like, what are we going to do with them? Like, here's money for school, go to school. Here's money for a house. Here's money for job training. It's considered one of the most powerful and sustaining economic development decisions in history. Trillions of dollars of value were created out of these people who went to school. They counted like 9 Nobel Prize winners who came out of that, plus all the other people who just got great jobs or whatever. Black citizens, black veterans, after fighting Hitler and other places, left out, would not be considered for those programs. Tiny, tiny fraction got anything. These are essentially a proactive effort to elevate white citizens into the middle class, right? So white affirmative action for many, many decades. So I know a lot of times we hear affirmative action is like, oh, it's kind of reversed, like, oh, we're going to let people into school based on race or based on various things. I'm like, well, we have a lot to make up for in that regard, because we did that for 90 years for white citizens. Okay, so you gotta get our history here. So let me go back to the continuum of inclusion. Segregation, structural legal separation. Assimilation. So we're going to move into this line of inclusion. What is assimilation? Well, assimilation is essentially, you know what? Okay, we got a good thing going on here in America. Let's let other people in. Let's not put these structural barriers. If they're able to make the grades and, dress a certain way or speak a certain way, we're going to let them into what we have created as a white standard culture. That's assimilation. So we're assimilating people. We often think about, my wife is an immigrant. She grew up in India, or she was born in India, grew up in Spain, came to this country 20-some years ago, is a citizen now. And she talks a lot about, I got really good at assimilating. She lived in the South for 20 years, so she got really good at assimilating. That is what assimilation is. Now, what's wrong with that? If from a white person's perspective, sometimes people are like, oh yeah, that's great. They got to assimilate. They got to learn how to be American. Whose definition of American are we asking them to become? It's the white created definition of America. And so the analogy is, hey, come and have a seat at our table. We're going to make room for you. There's a seat there. Come on in. But the room was organized by white folks with the purpose of white advancement, all these types of things. And we're going to ask you to, take a seat. Better than segregation. But if you're a person of color, how do you feel about that? Do you feel like your whole self can appear at that table? Or do you feel like you're going to leave a part of yourself over here so you can assimilate? So you get my point. Where we're trying to get, and by the way, this is really only thinking for like the last 10 or 15 years, and this is what's causing a lot of tension, because a lot of people are okay with assimilation. They're not really great with this final stage, which is anti-racism. This is don't just come to our table. Let's come and create a table together. You're a part of building this table. It's not you have to drop off yourself and have a seat. Bring yourself to creating this table. Other people can bring themselves to this table, and we'll become, we'll create a pretty cool table that is going to be different, but it's going to work for everybody. So that's a powerful analogy to me, is to think in that way. I'm going to skip over to a reading here in just a second. Covered a lot of this stuff. So the current question is, where are we now? There's some real tension around it. Are we a racist country? Gosh, we don't want to think of ourselves as that. But everything I just shared with you is official U.S. kind of history and policy. And so now the question is, where are we now? Are we good? Are we fixed all this stuff? Let me read this to you. Part of what this book is interesting, like I share a lot of like personal stories, but I go through a lot of history, and I even have some, forgive me, there's a few charts in there that kind of show some evidence. Black and Hispanic families on average hold less than 10% of the net worth of white families. I already mentioned that. An extensive study of available research in hiring discrimination, this was 55,000 people they studied, so huge sample, found that white applicants received 36% more callbacks. Callbacks are when you say, hey, I'd like this job, they actually call you back to invite you to interview. So white names, like Euro names, they got called back. If you had an ethnic sounding name or something, did not get nearly as much. This has not changed since they've been doing the research since 1989. In other words, the statistics are the same today as they were back in 1989. Despite improvements from the Affordable Care Act, people of color represent more than half of the non-elderly uninsured populations of the U.S. The Stanford Open Policing Project did a thorough analysis of police traffic stops from 20 states, covering more than 60 million state patrol stops, right? Again, a lot of political kind of emotion comes out when you talk about this, but these are the numbers. While addressing the complex challenges of measuring bias, the study found significant racial disparities in policing across white, black, and Hispanic drivers. Black drivers are 20% more likely to get a ticket instead of a warning after being pulled over. Hispanics are 30% more likely to receive a ticket than white drivers, and both black and Hispanic motorists can expect to be searched twice as often as white drivers. There's no suspicion here. This is just literally the numbers of, what happens if you get stopped and when you get stopped. And the United States Sentencing Commission found that African American men are sentenced to 20% longer sentences than white men for the exact same crime. So taking away all the variables, they get longer sentences. So there's so much statistical stuff that we could be here all night, but I know I got to get you out here. I want you just to sort of sit with this, not from the perspective of guilt and like feeling, but from the perspective of opportunity for the country, for the culture. One of the big things, and I'll sort of leave us with this. There's so much I wish I could share even more, but I want you just to think of the perspective of abundance mentality compared to like a scarcity mentality. Racism works pretty well in a scarcity mindset for a short term, right? If you want to get rich, or you want your small group of people to get rich, you could leave other people out. But it has horrific consequences for everyone else, particularly in the long term, which we've seen in the numbers. And so part of what I want to leave us with is, what is the opportunity? If you don't mind, I'm going to read a little section here. Is that all right? We'll end with that. We humans love power. We're addicted to it because it's such an attractive short-term antidote to fear. As fear courses through our minds and bodies, little doses of power we experience throughout the day soothe our insecurities and give us the false impression that we're in control. Beyond a feeling of safety, scientists have found that dopamine, that's the little drug that goes through your brain when something great happens, right, is released in our minds during activities that stroke our ego. But just like illicit drugs, the effect of this addiction to short-term feelings of power are highly destructive. The historian Henry Adams wrote, "The effect of power on all men is the aggregation of self, a sort of tumor that ends by killing the victim's sympathies. This addiction to power fuels the abusive husband, parents, coaches, teachers, police officers, local politicians. Power literally causes our brain to change, and it gets damaged by these continued doses of power. And it limits a human's ability to empathize and see things from another point of view." Perhaps my biggest eye-opener on my journey, particularly over the last 4 years when I wrote the book, is that the invention of race was one of the most powerful developments in history of power seeking, because it aggregated power under this false banner of whiteness that was made up. There was no real reason for it otherwise. So many satisfying dopamine hits of superiority and power get sent to those of us who are considered white when we walk down the street, when we watch television, or sit in a classroom or a meeting. I and other white categorized people have been raised as whiteness addicts without even realizing it. And as any addict will tell you, getting sober is a long, tough road. Last part. We don't consider ourselves addicts. The whole idea is very offensive. So respectable people aren't addicts, right? But watch how I act when our addictions to power are called out in a homeowner association meeting, or the decision to reorganize a company, or the PTA meeting to discuss the new school zoning plans. When our power is challenged, we flip out. We just do not like it. And that's the addiction. In fact, I felt that defensiveness recently when my daughter was calling me out on some privileges that I was exercising. How does an addict set themselves free? The answer, according to various recovery groups, alcoholics, narcotics, sex addicts, codependents, all of them, is that you can't set yourself free. To paraphrase the first 2 steps of the 12 Steps program, we admitted we were powerless over whiteness, that our lives had become unmanageable, and we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Austin Channing Brown, in her exceptional book, I'm Not Here, highly recommended, noted that after slavery, America could have put to death the idea of black inferiority. We could have just ended it there. But whiteness was not prepared to sober up from the drunkenness of power over another people group. And like every other addict, I had to seek power to change. That's tough to admit about yourself. It's tough to admit about our culture and many other things. Only the final paragraph here, the hope of greater joy. Why do you go through this? Why do you try to get sober? Only the hope of greater joy can motivate someone to embark on a lifestyle of such massive change. I have yet to buy into the joy of being healthy in order to give up my sweet tooth, but somehow my willingness to shed whiteness, theoretically much more ridiculous and difficult to attempt than just changing my diet, was implanted with a seed of joy from relationships with people of color throughout my life. And now it's blooming. It's been a challenging experience full of missteps. But after gaining the confidence to come out as a formerly white addicted person, I posted on Facebook a note about the scientific community's assessment of race and how we have common ancestry. And the first response was from an African American friend, and all she typed was, "Hello, my brother." Gets me a little teary even when I hear that. It was beautiful. Grace. She called me brother. And so I said, "Hello, my sister. It's worth the journey to give up whiteness, because I could not have that unless I did." So thank you. I'll be happy to take questions, but I know you gotta. Thank you.
Yes, late in the evening, but I if you have questions for Jeff, please.
I won't be offended if you need to go and, get to the game. Yeah.
I don't want to seem like I am coming after you, because I commend what you've done.
Sure.
But inherently, as you've pointed out, we do live in a society where we do appreciate whiteness, but also maleness. So how do you negate the fact that society will still give you privilege based on your white maleness?
Fantastic question. That is the key question. I actually do write about it at the end.
Okay.
I cannot control the privilege that is accrued to me from culture. What I can do, and what I hope I'm trying to do, is to use that privilege to turn it back on itself. I was literally asked by my friends to do that. There were some activists and some friends who look, if you could just take your whiteness back into a white world and explain this, maybe some people will listen. And that's really all we can do. I can't control the outside. I can only control, my own lens. But we absolutely have a responsibility, in my opinion, to use the accrued privilege to disrupt that false privilege. But great question. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for being here and welcome back home.
Thank you. It's
I'm
wonderful.
one of the newest members of faculty in Glenville. So, not going to lie, I took slight offense to your title. I've not read it.
Yep.
The whole concept of white superiority and all of that, I take it as offense in general.
Yeah.
Because when you continue to use that term and that concept, inadvertently you're saying inferiority.
Yeah.
You're proliferating this notion that me, as a cisgender black Filipino woman, 42-year-old millennial, however far we've gotten, when you're still using this language and you're still using those definitions, you're proliferating the narrative that has been destructive this whole time. And quite frankly, being here in Glenville, I think I take my privilege here and help first generation students create something that I've been given since 3 generations prior to. So I just wish and hope that you started at the point where we're only that much different from each other.
Right.
I appreciate and love learning about each other, understanding so many different walks of life. But I'm very frustrated by this new iteration of race consciousness.
Yeah.
Because quite frankly, it does take away from my father's legacy and my grandfather's legacy for all the different things that they've been able to do. And quite frankly, it's my peers that are getting the diversity jobs, knowing full well that they are the recipients of positive assimilation. And assimilation can be a negative term, but it also is this idea of, yes, I'm going to push my children to achieve greatness so that they can epitomize excellence wherever they go.
Right.
And nowhere is that talked about, knowing full well that all these PhDs running around are black chicks and men who are proliferating that greatness.
Right.
So it's just, I'm sorry, I had to
Yeah, no, I
speak
appreciate
to
it.
that
Yeah,
because
very
it's
good.
it's frustrating knowing full well that our society has made so many positive impacts to a point where I feel safer here in Glenville than I do in Baltimore and DC. So what does that make me? And I know that it's different for our students, and we're working on our student population because it's just,
Yeah. No, that's good.
I don't know. It's slightly frustrating to know that, we're making 5 paces up, and it's like, oh no, we're still crappy. No, we've got work to do.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think, first I'll say everything you're saying is valid and appreciated. I think that the hardest thing, I think not just for me, but for a lot of people about it, is looking at the macro and the micro at the same time. And I think where a lot of this sort of recent, I always think of society as like this pendulum, it's like we can't just seem to be balanced and keep moving forward. It just seems to ricochet all over the place. But what has happened is after the civil rights, and I have so much more I wish I could get into that probably would address this even more, but what happened during the civil rights era in the 60s? segregation was not fully, but largely obliterated. And so people had access to student loans and home loans and jobs and voting, which is really critical. And what happened? You saw a rocket ship again of potential progress of black and also other groups into the middle class. So in other words, it worked. It worked. But it didn't fully work because just like with Reconstruction worked for about 8 years. And then as soon as those protections were sort of pulled, boom, it just got hammered again with the Klan and Jim Crow. And so I think what's happened is that our country has hit a wall in terms of what it's willing to see as the final destination.
But
And
according to whom?
That's a very good question. I think, just as I mentioned what that table is, we have to collectively say, what's the next table? What's the new table of the United States of America? And there's a battle going on politically about what that looks like. There are literally people that do want to turn the clock back on voting rights. There are some people that are pushing for a lot of white supremacy, motivated policies. And they're very overt about it. I'm not just like accusing them. They're very clear about it. And so I think what we're trying to say is we got to get a little deeper under the covers. What is America? What has it been? What is it now? What will it be? And I'm suggesting that a clinging to a historic definition of America equals whiteness is the thing that's keeping us from that next phase. I think that's probably a good way to summarize it. Not to say that many individuals and even many groups have really advanced in many, many ways. But if you go through the grid of all the progress here, it kind of slams. And I read just a few of the disparities that we still see. I hope we'll get there, but it's going to take it's so hard because I was born at a time when the law was I couldn't have married my wife my current wife. It would have been illegal. So we had this huge shift forward, and then it just sort of stuck. And I think what we're trying to advocate for is we do not want to go backwards, and we definitely want to keep going forward. So that's the best I think for now I can respond, but I get what you're saying, and it's appreciated. Anybody else? Yeah.
This book's been very well received, from my understanding. Has it motivated you to think about, this is your first work, am I correct?
It is.
Yeah. Has it motivated you to think about others?
We were just talking about that. I have a dissertation of my own I got to get out of the way. That's going to be a lot of writing. But I think if I did write another one, it probably would be addressing this as like, okay, tangibly, what still needs to be done, and what does this look like to build a table together. I think there's a lot of practical, there are people out there doing amazing things in that realm, and I'd like to share those stories, but I can't promise anything at the moment. Okay, anyone else? I'm going to stick around. I definitely am going to see at least the second half of the game, but I'll be here for a while. Thank you very much for coming. It really means a lot to me, and yeah, thank you. Okay.
Thanks, everybody.